continuing through the book of Exodus, just going through the Bible, verse by verse, chapter by chapter. Last week we were in Exodus chapter 1. Today, Exodus chapter 2, introduction to Moses. And so just for a little recap. So from the end of the book of Genesis to the beginning of the book of Exodus is about 300 to 350 years in passing. And so in verse 7 in chapter 1, it says, "And the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly mighty while in Egypt." And it says that the land was filled with them. And this is actually what the Lord promised to Abraham back in Genesis 15 and other places too, that it says that his descendants would be strangers in a foreign land. They're going to multiply and increase into a great nation, but they're going to have to serve that foreign nation who would be Egypt, and they're going to afflict his people for 400 years. And then God says, but I'm going to bring them back to the land in the fourth generation. And we see that in Genesis 15, 13 through 16. And then what happened next in chapter 1, we saw that there was a new Pharaoh that came into office. It says that who knew not Joseph, and he also didn't know the true and living God, and he despised the children of Israel. He hated their fruitfulness, that they're increasing and multiplying. And so it says that he sent hard taskmasters over them to afflict them with burdens. And in verse 12 it says, "But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. And they were in dread of the children of Israel." And so the Pharaoh added more bondage, and they became slaves to these Egyptians with rigor, it says. And not only that, but the Pharaoh commanded that all the the two Hebrew midwives who were in charge of the rest of the midwives would abort all the male children from the Hebrew babies who were going to be born. And he didn't want the children of Israel to have this large military force to possibly overtake him and his kingdom. And so he was very narcissistic, this Pharaoh. But it says that the midwives, they didn't murder the newborn babies, but they obeyed God rather than man out of faith. And the children of Israel, it says, they only increased all the more. And next we see that the Pharaoh, he was angered, and he charged all the people in the land to murder every son that was going to be born and cast the newborn baby into the river. And we know that this was just demonically inspired. We know that Satan was always trying to stop the seed of the woman, seed of Abraham, from coming into the world, the Messiah. He was the one that's the deliverer, the true deliverer, to deliver mankind from sin and judgment. And we also see King Herod. We know that he tried to do that too. He knew that the Messiah was going to be born, and he was trying to figure out where he was at. And once he figured out where, he sent that same decree, all the male children. And so this was nothing really new. There's always the enemy trying to stop the plans of God, but he can't. He's foolish, trying to stop God's plans. Well, we come to chapter 2, verse 1. "And there went a man of the house of Levi, and took a wife, a daughter of Levi. And the woman conceived and bare a son. And when she saw him, that he was a goodly child," or a beautiful child if you have the New King James Version, "and she hid him 3 months. And when she could no longer hide him, she took for him an ark of bulrushes and daubed it with slime and with pitch, and put the child therein. And she laid it in the flags by the river's bank." And so we first see the birth of Moses. He came, it says, from the lineage of Levi, who would eventually be the priestly tribe. And Levi, he actually had 3 sons, and one of the sons was named Kohath, and we see this in Exodus 6:16. And Kohath, he begot Amram, and that's Moses' father. And Amram married his father's sister, actually his aunt, who is Jochebed. And so these two were Moses' parents, and we see this in Exodus 6:20. Eventually when we get there. And Moses, he was actually the youngest out of 3 children. He had an older brother, Aaron, 3 years older than him, actually, and an older sister, Miriam. We see this in Exodus 7:7 and Exodus 15:20. Miriam was probably around the age of 6 during this time. And so when Moses was born, it says that his mom saw that he was a goodly child or a proper child or a beautiful child. And we know that Moses wrote this book as well. And so he wanted everyone to know that he was a beautiful child. Also the most humble man as well. But I think every mother sees their child beautiful, good, and proper. But we know that the Lord, most importantly, sees that child as beautiful and precious in his sight. He created in his image. And so she hid Moses for 3 months to spare his life, because there was that decree, remember, that all the newborn babies would have to be cast into the Nile. In verse 3, and when she could no longer hide him, babies, they cry. Maybe it was getting too dangerous. Maybe it was just very obvious. She took for him an ark. And that's the same word that was used for Noah's ark, of bulrushes or of papyrus. Egyptian ships were used, they used the same type of wood. And it says, and she daubed it or sealed it with slime or asphalt and with pitch, tar. Same words that were used for the building of Noah's ark as well, but he had gopher wood. And so she put the child therein. She laid this basket, this ark right there in the flags, which are basically water plants, the reeds, by the river's bank, the Nile River. Why? Well, I think that she knew that this is where the Pharaoh's maidens would be, and she knew that the story of Noah as well. We also see that she believed in the seed of the woman. She believed in the seed of Abraham, and out of faith, this is what she was led to do overall. Now, Stephen, the first martyr, he actually spoke about this account, and we're going to keep going back to Acts 7 and Hebrews 11. But in Acts 7, when he was preaching, he said in verse 20, at this time Moses was born. He was a beautiful child in God's sight, and he was cared for in his father's home for 3 months. And the account was also mentioned in Hebrews 11, again, showing that his parents were believers. And what they did, this act was an act of faith based on vision, because they knew that, they believed in the seed, they believed in the blood sacrifice, they believed in the resurrection from the dead. They knew the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Abraham believed that Isaac was going to be resurrected. They knew the story of Noah. They knew the story of Jacob. They knew the gospel. Galatians says that was the gospel. The seed was going to come through you, and through you all the nations would be blessed. And so they had vision. Hebrews 11:23 says, by faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents, because they saw that he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's command. Fear and faith do not mix together. And so this was an act of faith based on vision that the Lord gave them. They knew that God was doing something, and they wanted to partake in what God was doing. And so the ark was a testimony, okay? That's what basically it was. It was a testimony of and a speaking of a faith that their parents had. And it caused her and her husband not to live out of the fear of man, but to trust in God's promise. Well, verse 4. And his sister, we know that's Miriam, stood afar off to know what would be done to him. So she's seeing everything. In verse 5, then the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river. Jewish historian Josephus tells us that Pharaoh's daughter, Thermudis, was his only child and had not a son yet to be an heir. And so this could have possibly been an heir to Pharaoh. And her maidens walked along the riverside, and when she saw the ark among the reeds, she sent her maid to get it. So she saw this ark just sitting there. I wonder what's in this ark. Verse 6, and when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby wept. And so she had compassion on him. and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." So how does she know that this is one of the Hebrews' children? Well, maybe because of just how the baby was wrapped, maybe the diaper, it was a certain Hebrew cloth, his skin color, multiple ways, but it says that she had compassion on him, very contrary to the Pharaoh, who just hated all the Hebrews. Well, verse 7, "And then his sister Miriam said to Pharaoh's daughter," so Miriam approached her and said, "Shall I call a nurse for you, for the Hebrew woman, that she may nurse the child for you?" Which is a great suggestion. In verse 8, "And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, 'Go.' So the maiden went and called the child's mother." So Miriam, the nurse that she got was her own mom, the mother of Moses. Verse 9, "So then the Pharaoh's daughter said to her, 'Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages.' So the woman took the child and nursed him." And so while Moses' mom was able to nurse him, what a blessing, what a miracle. There's no coincidences with God. I think that's super special. Verse 10, "And the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And so she called his name Moses, saying, 'Because I drew him out of the water.'" So Moses' mom was able to nurse the child. Remember, he was only 3 months old at the time, and she was able to nurse him until he was older. Doesn't say what age, possibly from the ages of 5 to 12, give or take. But as Moses was growing up, he was still very young. During this time, his parents must have shared with him the gospel as well. They must have, because we're going to see eventually in Hebrews 11 that Moses was a believer as well, and he's also in Hebrews 11. So sometime during the time that he was raised in the household, during that small period of time, either he believed or he actually at least heard the gospel. Just keep that in mind. And so after he grew, he was sent back to Pharaoh's daughter, and she raised him, and she adopted him and became his son. And basically she went against her father's edict to murder all the Hebrew babies. I don't know how he was able to grow up in the household, but he did. It was the Lord, actually. That's how we know. And it says, "So she called his name Moses, saying, 'Because I drew him out of the water.'" Moses, that's what it means, to draw out or to pull out. And we see more of this account again in Acts 7. In Acts 7:21, "But when he was set out, Pharaoh's daughter took him away and brought him up as her own son. And Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and was mighty in words and deeds." We weren't told this in Exodus, but we are told this right here, that he was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and he was mighty in words and deeds. Very similar to Daniel. Remember to Daniel? He was learned in all the deeds of the Babylonians, and he knew the literature and the language. Same thing with Moses. He was mighty in words and deeds. And we know that the Egyptians, and pretty much every world power, it was also a works religious system. Very religious. The Egyptians had plethora of different gods. They're very spiritual and religious. Same thing with the Babylonians. But every world power is very works religious based. And eventually that's how it's going to be like too in Book of Revelations as well. But so he knew all the occult practices. He was trained. And that's interesting because by the time he's 80 years old, when he meets the Lord in the burning bush, he's going to say, I can't speak. I can't go ahead and speak to Pharaoh. I have a speech impediment. But here he was mighty in deeds and words, but we're going to see that God's going to have to break him. He's not as mighty that he thinks he is. but it's going to be in his weakness where the Lord's going to use him the greatest. Verse 11. Now it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown, he's no longer young anymore, he's grown, that he went out to his brethren and looked at their burdens. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. Verse 12. So he looked this way, he looked that way, and when he saw no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Now, in the book of Acts, Stephen tells us that Moses was actually 40 years old during this time. When it says that he was grown, he was 40 years old. So from verses 10 and 11, a total of 40 years has passed. He was a grown man. Again, he was learning all the wisdom of the Egyptians. And we see that in Acts 7, 23 to 24. Now, when he was 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brethren, the children of Israel, and seeing one of them suffer wrong, he defended and avenged them who was oppressed and smote down the Egyptian. So throughout these 40 years, he knew he was a believer, and he knew what God was doing, and he wanted to partake in what God was doing. He sensed the call in his life that, hey, this is the promise that God made to Abraham. He's going to bring us into the land, the promised land. And he sensed that, hey, God's going to use me as a deliverer. And apparently the Lord confirmed that to him, which was true. But just imagine 40 years. He grew up in the house of Pharaoh. Man, when's God going to use me? He's just waiting around. I don't know. When's God going to use me? Why isn't he? Is he going to tell me to do something? And so, I'm just going to take action by myself. So he had the right intention. We're going to see that by faith he stopped dwelling with all the Egyptians and all their ways to actually look at the children of Israel, actually have compassion on them, and actually try to deliver them. But he did it the wrong way. The way that he went about it was in his own strength. And he tried to take matters in his own hands. He killed the Egyptian, but he didn't have any victory for the Lord, even though his intentions seemed right. And so, he killed the Egyptian officer, the taskmaster, and tried to cover it up by burying him in the sand. Verse 13. And when he went out to the second day, behold, 2 Hebrew men were fighting, and he said to the one who did wrong, why are you striking your companion? In verse 14, then he said, who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? And so Moses feared and said, surely this thing is known. So it seems like he went out the second day on his mission, and he's trying to make a change. He assumed that his brethren caught on that, hey, God has me to be, your great deliverer. And so when Moses came out the second day, he saw his own brethren fighting this time. And Moses, he was trying to be a peacemaker. Hey, stop. Why are you fighting? Don't fight. But they just saw Moses as just, hey, the privileged one who's trying to be a judge over them. And he assumed that, you may even kill one of us, like you did to the Egyptian. And so they didn't understand that actually God chose him to be their deliverer. But at the same time, he did go about it the wrong way. Stephen gives us more information on this account in Acts 7, verses 23 to 29. He says, now when he was 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brethren, the children of Israel. Seeing one of them suffer wrong, he defended them, avenged them who was oppressed, struck the Egyptian down. Verse 25, for he supposed that his brethren would have understood that God would deliver them by his hand again, but they did not understand. And he repeats the same account. They rejected him. They rejected Moses. They didn't see him as a deliverer, only some judge. They couldn't comprehend that, hey, is this how God's going to try to rescue us? Through just violence like that? And it really wasn't. That's really not how God wanted to do it. But very similar to Abraham, remember? Abraham knew his calling too. He knew that the Lord was going to provide a seed through his lineage. And, okay, well, God, how are you going to do this? Sarah can't, we're too old. We're going to have a child? Oh, yeah, we'll go into Hagar. Yeah, okay, well, I'm going to help God out. Like Moses tried to help God out. And Abraham went into Hagar to produce the child of the flesh. And Ishmael was rejected. And Abraham had to learn, hey, I'm not going to try to help God out. I can't do this on my own flesh. I need to trust in the Lord. And it has to be something that the Lord is going to provide supernaturally. No one can do anything for the Lord unless the Lord first provides the means. And so eventually God did supernaturally provide Abraham a son through Sarah, Isaac. And it's the same lesson that Moses needed to learn as well. Yeah, it's good that, we know what we're supposed to be doing, and we have vision, we have faith, we know our calling, but the Lord needs to take us to the process of we need to come to the end of our flesh. And it's not about our ability, it's not about our wisdom, not about the skills that we learned in Egypt that God wants. We're not something, I'm this special person that God's going to use and all of my skills and abilities, and I'm this amazing person. But God wants to show us, He's the amazing one. It's His strength, it's His ability, it's His might, and that's what Moses had to learn. He had to realize what his flesh is, and that the Lord will not use the flesh. He doesn't look at Ishmael, not by might, not by power, but what? By my spirit, says the Lord. And it says in verse 14, so Moses feared and said, surely this thing is known. So Moses knew, hey, the word got around. People know. Verse 15. And when Pharaoh heard of this matter, he sought to kill Moses. Since Moses slew an officer, and that was the law at that time, can't do that. There is a death penalty. All the officers were protected by the Pharaoh. But Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian, it says. And he sat down by a well. So Moses left Egypt, and he fled to Midian. And so if you have your map there, it's from Egypt to Midian was about 350 miles. And that took about 6 days or so. And I was trying to figure out, why did he go to Midian? Out of all these places, why Midian? Why didn't he just go somewhere else? And it's a speculation, but think about if you're leaving California, what's closer to go to? If you're trying to just leave California, Canada or Mexico? Mexico would be closer, but you're at least out of Canada, or you're at least out of California. And so Midian would be a place that you're out of Egypt, but it's not too far, but it's still out of the jurisdiction. And just kind of like when David ran away from King Saul, he went to the Philistines until God called him back. And so I kind of see it as that. It was like the shortest trip that he could make out of the jurisdiction of Egypt. And so it was a desert wilderness, as we'll see later on. But in Hebrews, we're actually told this account from God's perspective, okay? And God actually doesn't acknowledge what Moses did in the flesh, but he only acknowledges what was wrought in faith. Hebrews 11:24 through 27. By faith, Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater than the riches, than the treasures in Egypt. For he looked to the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king. For he endured as seeing him who is invisible. Wow. Moses, he could have been the next Pharaoh. He was on deck to be the next Pharaoh. He could have enjoyed all the pleasures that Pharaoh had. all the pleasures of sin, all the treasures that he could have had. He could have made a name for himself, could have been super big in the world. But instead, he chose to follow the calling of God's life, the calling that God had on his life to deliver God's people and to suffer because of it, because he looked to the reward. Remember what God said to Abraham? I am your exceeding great reward. Abraham looked to the same person, Christ, who is his reward as well. So Moses had the same faith again as Abel, who trusted in the blood, same faith as Noah, same faith as Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, same faith as his parents. He believed in the blood offering. He believed in judgment from deliverance from judgment. He believed in the resurrection from the dead, an inheritance. And he was looking to a city whose builder and maker is the Lord. And this is what Moses had. This was faith, and faith always has vision of what God is doing. And Moses wanted to take part in it. And all this blood sacrifice, the inheritance, the city, the resurrection is all centered on the seed. All linked to the seed, who is our reward as well. So for Moses and for all those before who believed in the coming seed, the promised seed, it was just a promise to hope for. But for us, it's a reality. He did come. He was crucified for our sins, for the sins of the whole world, and he did rise from the grave. And he's not the Jesus walking around on the earth where we're trying to figure out, where's Jesus at? No, he's the ascended Christ who's seated at the right hand of the Father, who makes intercession for us. And he's also the life-giving Spirit who dwells in all believers. And he is our inheritance. He is our good land. He is our sacrifice. He is our reward. He is our everything. And he's given us the Spirit as a foretaste of that inheritance that we're going to enter when this mortal is going to put on immortality, where this corrupt flesh is going to put on incorruption. When we enter fully into that inheritance, but he's given us the Spirit now as a foretaste of what's to come, of the glories to follow. And we see that same faith in Moses and in Abraham. Well, verse 27 of Hebrews 11, by faith again, he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. And so we would have never know this account. We would have never know how God saw Moses during this time, right? Without the book of Hebrews. If we just read Exodus, we wouldn't know this. And so that's why it's so important for us to know the whole counsel of God's word and be established in present truth. And so now Moses, he's in Midian, 40 years old, on the other side of the Sinai Peninsula, west of Arabia, Saudi Arabia. And it says that he comes to get refreshed at a specific well. Verse 16 of Exodus 2. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water, and they filled the troughs to water their father's flock. Verse 17, then the shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and helped them and watered their flock. So Moses, he learned his lesson. He didn't murder anyone else this time, but this time he saw there's 7 shepherdesses, and then there's these men shepherds, and they're big bullies, and they're messing with the shepherdess. Maybe they've done this in the past to them. Maybe they were flustered by them. And so he stood up and he helped them. He defended the 7 shepherdesses. And which is a really good act. Now the priest of Midian in verse 18, his name is Ruel. Okay, he's the priest of Midian, and his name means a friend of God. And he also has another name named Jethro, as we're going to see in chapter 3, which means his abundance. And so it's the same person, the priest of Midian, Ruel, and Jethro. It's all the same person. Maybe it's his first and last name. Exodus 3:1 says that. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, we're eventually going to see, the priest of Midian. Okay. And so the Midianites, who are they? Well, apparently they were the descendants of Abraham through Keturah. And Keturah was Abraham's third wife after Sarah died. And Midian was one of Abraham's sons. So he wasn't a part of the 12 tribes from Jacob, Isaac and Jacob, but he was one of Abraham's descendants. And that word priest, the priest of Midian, could also mean a chief. He was a chief of Midian or a ruler of Midian. Or it could mean he was a priest, but a pagan priest. Like there was the Egyptian priests. Since there was no priestly institution yet, the only time we saw that word priest, other than the Egyptian priest, was Melchizedek, right? That was the only other time we saw that. The king of Salem and the priest of the Most High, which I believe was Christophany, pre-incarnate Christ, or at least a type of. But it is possible that the priest of Midian may have also been a worshiper of Yahweh, the true and living God. Maybe Abraham taught him the same God that revealed himself to Abraham. But we're not totally sure. But these Midianites the majority of them were pagans, and they were nomads in this land. And in chapter 18, we do see that the priest of Midian, Reuel, actually did worship the Lord and acknowledge Yahweh as the true and living God. So we do see, at least in chapter 18, that he was a believer. But as far as what kind of priest, we're not really sure. Verse 18. Now when they came to Reuel, their father, so the 7 prophets come back to their father, and he says, "How is it that you have come so soon today?" And they said, "An Egyptian delivered us from the hand of the shepherds, and he also drew enough water for us and watered the flock." And so he said to his daughters, "And where is he? Why is it that you have left the man? Call him, that he may eat bread." And then Moses was content to live with the man, and he gave Zipporah, his daughter, to Moses. And she bore him a son and called his name Gershom, for he said, "I have been a stranger in a foreign land." And so all they can tell was at first, like, man, this guy who defended us and gave us water, and who is this man? Well, he's an Egyptian. He looked like an Egyptian. Maybe he was wearing Egyptian clothes. He kind of we had an Egyptian accent. He maybe walked like an Egyptian. But this was the good report that the daughters told Reuel, their father. But he delivered them. He delivered us. That's the most important part. He stood up for us, and he gave our flock enough water, and he gave us water too. He served us, like a couple other people that we saw in the account of Genesis, right, when they met their wives. But I can also see this as kind of like how Christ is too. How he gives his life for the sheep as a true shepherd. There's shepherds who are abusive, who hinder the flock from drinking the living water, and they don't have your best interest. They mix law with grace, and they hinder you from enjoying the well, who is Christ, the living water. And Moses can be like that type of Christ, of standing up and no. Jesus said in John 10 that there's hirelings, that when they see a wolf coming, they run away. But Jesus said, "I'm the true shepherd," and the true shepherd gives his life for the sheep. And Moses stood up for them, and he gave them water. And the same thing for us. True shepherds protect the sheep from wolves. True shepherds point one another to the source. Like, I'm not here to feed you. I'm here just to point you to Christ. He's the source. He's your food. He's your drink. If you know what a shepherd does, you don't force feed the sheep any food, right? No, he just points you to the pasture. No, this is poison here. These are sticks. this isn't the good food right here. Don't eat this, right? This is false doctrine here. No, this is a false teaching right here. Beware of this. That's what true shepherds do, and true shepherds know that they're also a sheep as well. They don't think that they're better than anyone else and know it all. And we all could come freely to Christ and drink of the living water today. Nothing's going to hinder you. Doesn't matter if you have sin. Even if you have sin, you have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ the righteous. Don't let anyone tell you that you can break your fellowship with God the moment you sin, because we all sin every day. And he's given you the fountain of living water in you, and you can enjoy Christ today no matter what your condition is. And so right away, Ruel knew that, hey man, this man is honorable. Tell him to come over and break bread with us. Yeah, and so they must have conversated and talked, and Ruel knew that, hey, this is a good man to marry one of my daughters, for sure. And so he gave Moses Zipporah, and for sure Moses, I think he had a choice too. I don't think it was like, her, I don't know, fine, I'll marry. No, I think he liked her as well. And so it happened in verse 21, and Moses was content to live with Ruel, and he gave Zipporah to Moses to marry, and she bore him a son and called him Gershom, for he said, I have been a stranger in a foreign land. And so obviously, at least 9-11 months past, he has a son now, Gershom, and he named his child Gershom, for I have been a stranger in a foreign land. We know that Moses also had a second child as well, named Eliezer. But I love that. I love Gershom, that name, for I have been a stranger in a foreign land. That's a mark of a man who understands what the flesh is, that God will not use the flesh. It's a mark of a man who all of his confidence is stripped away from him. All of his selfish ambitions, all of his confidence in his flesh, thinking that he's some special person. That's why God chose me. I'm a beautiful child. I was raised in the king's household. God, all this stripped from him. He's broken now. All of his strength is torn away from Moses. He's separated from all of his countrymen. He's in Midian. And now he's learning to be a shepherd and be a father, live a quiet life, and be content. And it's at the point where you realize, man, I'm a stranger in a foreign land. I'm not this great and mighty person that, I could do this whole Christian walk in my flesh, and I know how it is to, do the Christian walk. I know how to tame the flesh. I do great things for God. Who are you to tell me I have to reckon myself dead to sin? I could pick up my cross and follow the Lord. Look at the calling that I have in my life. Look all the good things I have. No, that the Lord showing Moses, yeah, you have a calling upon your life, but you need to come to the end of your flesh. You need to bottom out from thinking that you're the man. No, Christ is the man. And so this act of delivering Ruel's daughters was just a foretaste of what the Lord's going to continue to do in Moses' life, but it's going to take another 40 years of dwelling in Midian, and sometimes that's what it takes in our life. He's going to be 80 years old before he's going to go back to Egypt, we're going to see, where he's going to meet the Lord in the burning bush, and face-to-face going to speak to Jesus. He's going to see that bush, which represents Moses, his flesh, and the fire representing the Lord. The fire is not consuming the flesh, but he needs to trust in the power of God, not his own strength. All of our strength needs to be torn down. And during this 40 years dwelling in Midian, it could have been the most fruitful times. Imagine that, though. I thought the Lord had this great calling upon my life, though. I was so sure about it, and it's true. But now he has to wait another 40 years, we're going to see. Just imagine that futility. And a lot of times for us too, a lot of the times when we're sick or we're beaten up, when things in our life are stripped away from us, our relationships are broken, our health is messed up, we're not getting answered prayers. We have so much things that are broken in our lives, and we come to a place of futility. And that's when Christ is wrought in us. And we're realizing that it's not about my might, not about my strength. He's going to work all things together for good, but he's teaching us to rely on him and to trust in him and challenge us. Is God really going to work all things together for good in my situation? Yes, he is. But it's a matter of learning to be content in whatever state we're in. We know that this is not our home. It's not our home. Moses had that vision. We need that vision. We have that vision as believers. It's faith. This is not our home. And a lot of times it allows the things in our life to wear out the natural man. That's what the Lord's doing here, right here in Moses. He's wearing out the natural man. He's wearing out the strength of the natural man, the confidence in the natural man. He's done that to me tons of times. I had to bottom out. I thought I was the most zealous Christian. And I thought I knew how to live the Christian life, and I was harming people. Well, I can do this. Look at me. I'm this great evangelist. I can do all these things. I think I could do this. And when I would minister to people, I was putting demands on them. I was mixing law with grace, and I had to bottom out of my flesh. And the Lord had to teach me separation, like Moses. I had to be separated from all the false teachings that I was listening to. I had to be separated from all my selfish ambitions of religious zeal and come to the place where I'm resting in God's grace, being content where I'm at with the Lord, being in a place where I don't even care. I'm just thankful that you saved me. Thankful for your grace. Thankful that I'm a child of God. Thank you that you're my inheritance. You're my everything. You're my reward. I'm not trying to earn all these rewards I'm trying to work them for my inheritance. No, he is our inheritance. There is one inheritance. We partake together, and it's Christ. He is our everything. And that's what he does in our life, and sometimes it takes 80 years. Maybe you feel like you're backslidden. Maybe Moses might have felt backslidden. And there's a lie that you have to make up from all the things that you've done in the past. Maybe you might feel guilty for something that you did. Maybe Moses was feeling guilty for murdering that guy. But I think being backslidden, you have to try to make up for your past, and so you could boast about what you've done now. I think that's a myth. God picks us up right where we're at. There is no trying to make up for your past. Whatever it is, whatever it's your spiritual walk, a relationship, whatever it is, he picks us up right where we're at. That's his grace. And he works through our weakness. He works through our seasons of dryness, being in a wilderness, and he always leads us to the well, Christ, our source. It's always him. This is what Moses is learning. This is where our ministry comes out. So now we could speak into others with grace, and we could give grace to one another. You're saved by the blood of Christ. I'm saved by the blood of Christ. I'm going to give you grace. It doesn't matter what you went through. I'm not going to see you as your past. I'm looking at the eyes of grace because I know what my flesh is. We have the same flesh, and we both need the grace of God. So let's point each other to Christ. And that's a ministry. People think that they can do this thing. They start placing burdens on others and demands on others, and they tear down the body instead of building the body up. And so when God disciplines us, he always points us back to grace. When we're getting a little bit too legalistic on things, or we start mixing law with grace, he always points us back to him. Just walking by faith, a simple life, living a quiet and a peaceable life where you're not trying to please man, you're tired of playing those religious games, but you're enjoying Christ, and Christ is shepherding us back into rest, shepherding us back to the word that we have heard from the beginning. Not that you try to love God, but that he first loved us. And sometimes it takes a while. Chapter 2, verses 23 to 25 to close. Now it happened in the process of time that the king of Egypt died. Then the children of Israel groaned because of the bondage, and they cried out, and their cry came up to God because of the bondage. So God heard, mark that, God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham. He never forgot. He always remembered. With Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And God looked upon the children of Israel, and God acknowledged them. Now, it happened in the process of time. Well, how long was this? Well, we're told in Acts 7:30 that 40 years have passed. So Moses is 80 years now when the Pharaoh died, the one that gave the edict to cast all the babies into the water. He died now. And the Pharaoh that died may have been King Seti I or Ramses I, the founder of the 19th dynasty. And so this next Pharaoh that's eventually going to come may have been Ramses II, one of the greatest pharaohs from 1301 to 1234. But it says that the children of Israel cried out after 40 years of just still being in bondage. Imagine that, man. Just heavy laden and weary. 40 years. And it says in verse 24 that God heard their groaning. God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He never forgot, okay? He promised Abraham that through his seed, which all the promises would come to, who's the seed? Christ. It was actually a covenant that God made with Christ to shepherd the sheep. That Christ would come to the world. That Christ is the blessing. Christ is the inheritance. He is the one that inherits the land. It's Christ's land. He's the heir of all things. And he's going to give the land to the believing Israel. And he's going to lead them to the land. Okay, God hasn't forgotten. He hasn't forsaken them. You can feel like you're forsaken by God. I feel like you've forsaken me. You're not listening to me. But God acknowledges you. He remembers all the promises of God, which are yes and amen. And we see in chapter 3, when Lord speaking to Moses, he says in chapter 3, verses 7 through 10, I've surely seen the oppression of my people. I've heard their cry because of their taskmasters. For I know their sorrow. So I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of Egyptians and bring them up to the land, good land, a large land, flowing with milk and honey. And so the Lord always remember his promises, okay? Again, it's easy to think that God's maybe angry at us. He's forsaken us. Maybe when life's going bad, we think that God's punishing us. Life's going good. He's happy with us. We pray for something that's not answered the way we want it to. We could even think that God's angry at us and punishing us, or he's holding our sins against us. That's why things are happening. We get frustrated. But that's not true. We can reap what we sow at times. Sin has its consequences. But God, that's not his heart towards us. He is our Father. Jesus is our good shepherd. And he knows what we're going through. And all we can do, sometimes the best thing to do is just say, Lord, have mercy on me. I'm at the place of checkmate where everything it's not as what I thought it's going to be. And I'm not at the place where I thought I wanted to be here. But I have you and you have me, and you hear my cry. You're my Father. I'm your child. I'm well-pleasing in your sight because I'm in Christ. He's my righteousness. And I cast my cares upon you because you care for me. And in my weakness, I find your strength. And that's a good place to be at times. He's always been there. He always hears. He never forgets you. He always sees. He acknowledges you. And he will work all things together for good. He's directing our steps. And this is how maturity in our Christian walk culminates. And so he kind of reminds me of what Jesus said, hey, come to me all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Okay, Lord, there's nothing else I can do. Checkmate. This is where you want me to be, and I'm okay with that. You're a good God, and you're faithful. I'm content. This place is not my home. But there's a city and builder whose maker is the Lord. And you're my inheritance. And you're with me all the way. And those are some things that the Lord spoke to me through this. And so I hope we're encouraged.